Hello and welcome to Autology, the podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week, we're bringing you our final coverage of the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas in 2023. You're here with me, Jeremy Carlson, Associate Director for our Autonomy Practice, Phil Amsurd, Senior Principal Analyst and our Specialist in Semiconductors, and Colin Martinez, Principal Consultant. Hello to you both, and thanks for joining this week's episode of Autology.
Hello, Jeremy.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely happy to have you guys. It was great to see you last week at CES. And I think that honestly is where we want to start. Getting back to the show, getting to meet all of these people in person that we haven't seen in a couple of years, for me was, I think, one of the biggest takeaways, not to undermine any of the messaging and the amazing products that we saw on site, but honestly, just to get back in person with our customers, with the industry was just one of the most interesting things and the most rewarding parts of CES. Any kind of initial highlights from you guys before we dive into some of the vehicle announcements, the vehicle launches that we saw there? For sure, the positioning of this show as a supplier exhibition. Interesting here, you guys want to call out before we jump into it?
Yeah, I'll take a stab first, Phil. The stats have finally came out. We had made an estimate before, but the CES or CTA in this respect said there was about 115,000 attendees. Last year, we had intended to go to the show like many of our customers and OEMs, but ultimately, not to bring up past trauma, there was Omicron, right? So the show really had 45,000 last year. And we're still behind 2020, which was 171,000. Just personally thinking about how China just recently opened up, a lot of folks there weren't able to make their arrangements to come, and that the South Hall was dedicated mostly to prototype testing to a degree, but majorly to code check and most importantly, COVID testing. So if you think next year when we bring that back and we have the small electronics here and more buyers in China, I really do think, honestly, we could have a banner year next year. And to your point, too, one of the main benefits was after all these years, finally seeing the faces we have seen our peers for so long, not being able to see them was a detriment, ultimately, I think, to everyone in this industry. So just being able to reconnect and listen to people and share ideas, that was the most important thing for me.
Agreed. And honestly, seeing the new West Hall for the first time in person was also really cool. But you're right that everything did shift a little bit away from that South Hall, using it for some other purposes here this year. But really getting, again, that consolidation of all of this automotive power in West Hall. It was densely packed and it was full of automotive technology for sure.
Yeah, agreed. And what I like about having that extra hall and North Hall seems to still be partially automotive is I hope one gets into LCV soon. This was a year where we did a lot less offsite. Offsite can be very difficult. And I understand one has an offsite suite, regardless, Google, everyone. But it's great to also have everyone. It's essentially an auto show in West Hall now, and North Hall is like that, but this is more thorough. And as far as I'm aware, LCV Convention Center, it partially was created, the West Hall for the growing automotive in this show. And I wonder actually longer term, as it becomes more of an auto show, how is that going to affect the consumer electronic aspect of the show? You never know where this is going. And maybe eventually this is its own show.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, especially as a lot of the consumer electronics industry they're hosting their own dedicated events, right? Like you're launching an iPhone, you're going to Apple's event, you've got the Pixel events from Google, even like events like E3 around gaming have all split up into their individual kind of studio versions rather than convention like this. But yeah, I agree with you, but this is for sure turning into, it has been, right? But it's turning back into a really prominent auto show. Not just for suppliers. It's always been, I think, a really important and needed exhibition for suppliers in North America. We really didn't have that for a number of years, aside from the couple of companies that would demonstrate at the North American International Auto Show in Detroit every year. But we've also seen a bit of a slowdown in years past and now coming back very strongly with a lot of vehicle announcements from manufacturers here at CES in 2023. Everything from the BMW with their new concept, the digital emotional experience. We had Mercedes with the Vision EQ XX, Chrysler's synthesis concept, Peugeot fact with its Inception concept EV that was shown first at Paris last year, but kind of a new brand showcasing its wares here on the show floor in Las Vegas. A couple of really prominent ones here that we'll hit quickly in succession. Playing here with the ID.7, I think was perhaps one of the more important reveals at the show, and a pretty important one, of course, for Volkswagen. Colin, what kind of details do we have on the ID.7? Where does it really fit in kind of the scale of important launches here at CES from the OEM side?
Yeah, no, it certainly was as a production ready vehicle, one of the few. A lot of them were still conceptual. It is very interesting in the age of the slow death of the sedan to bring the sedan and talk about that rather than a 3-row SUV. Eventually they will talk about it. But the ID.7, you can really think of it. It's not, some people mention it as a Volkswagen Passat replacement. It's not that. It's a Volkswagen RTI and a Volkswagen Passat CC prior to that replacement. It's a German import to the US, which makes sense. They're canceling or discontinuing, I should say, the US specific Volkswagen Passat in the Chattanooga plant. And they're replacing, the ID series in Chattanooga to take advantage of our different incentives in the US that require domestic production. So the fact that it's imported from Germany suggests to me that this is going to be a low volume vehicle and not priced as a EV mainstream sedan. It's probably going to be more premium in that $50,000 range. What they quoted was a 435-mile range in the European cycle, which is probably going to translate around 350-mile range for the US. They claim right now it will be their longest range vehicle when it comes out in 2024, which is the expected time frame for the US. One interesting thing about it, just like the BMW concept you just mentioned, Volkswagen was the first outside of BMW to now show conceptually this changing color of paint. It required 40 layers of paint to make. It's electrified paint that allows a small spectrum of pretty bright and drastic different colors to be chosen, and also incorporates a QR code so you can learn more about the vehicles. From a marketing perspective, that's very clever. Obviously, that's not going to be production ready, and who knows where that technology is going, but now two German OEMs are talking about it. So that's what's going on with the ID.7. And one other interesting thing is they're really going all in on this digital HVAC, HMI system. They've had a lot of pain with that, right? A lot of delays. The whole Artemis line, which is wagon vehicles, but also Porsches and Bentleys, we're going to use the Audis in particular, the Landjet. That's delayed. So it's the fact that they think now that they can bring HVACs through only VPA and the touchscreen shows a level of confidence they have in whatever's happening with the soon to be announced builds of the Volkswagen OS, but they have had problems with that in the past. And when you look at the interior of this 15-inch screen, pretty much, and its position in the car, it does have a little speedometer, but beyond that, it definitely looks like they've taken a lot of inspiration from the Tesla Model 3.
Yep, it'll be a pretty important launch, especially with, as you said, all of the work that's been going into the software expertise within VW, not to mention Ariad, which had its own booth on the show floor as well. Yeah, it'll be pretty important here when this comes to market in 2023 here with its first SOP in Europe and then coming to the US here the following year.
Yeah, they're definitely a first fast follower from Tesla, going in alone and really focusing that they have the software prowess as well. So we'll see where that's going, right? They've had a little growing pain with the ID.3 and the ID.4. Hey, but now we're up in the numbers, right? We're at an ID.7. So we'll see what happens,
Even more mature. We'll get there for sure. Next one, actually, speaking of fair and getting into some of the newer manufacturers who were on the show floor and unveiling some vehicles. We had Sony Honda Motors launching their new brand, Afeela, with their first, still an early kind of concept vehicle, but certainly taking some pretty important steps after that first introduction a couple of years ago here towards bringing this vehicle to market. Really interesting kind of combination of the technology, in particular from Sony and Sony Studios, all of the different forms of IP and entertainment content that they have, but really bringing all of that hardware expertise that they have into this vehicle. Phil, I remember from the unveiling, they mentioned 45 cameras. They mentioned 800 tops in the centralized domain controller. Quite a bit of content too that they're packing into this one.
Yeah, and just to make a small refinement, there are 45 sensors those 45, 14 cameras.
Yep. Thank you for the correction.
But I think it's in addition to what it means for Sony and Honda, I think it's interesting from an overall industry perspective because it's emblematic of a number of important trends. One, as you pointed out, just the sheer number of sensors. And it feels like the industry is moving away from having to have a complete triple redundancy in terms of a 360 cocoon around the car, one of the mains being cameras, then radars, and then a third one being LiDAR, and that the industry is now trying to come up with a more balanced mix of those. And again, using Afila as a straw man for this, cameras are well established, ultrasonics are well established, radars are established. They seem to be expanding their sphere of influence, especially as they go from resolution to imaging resolution. And not that this is on Afila, but I heard a number of very interesting storylines in terms of imaging radar, be it from Arbe, NXP, NVIDIA, and others that are looking at a corner and front-facing higher resolution radars, and then the pressure that's putting on LiDAR. LiDAR still seems to have a place in the mix of most cars' sensor suites, but it no longer seems to be assumed that there's going to be a 360-degree cocoon of LiDAR around the car. LiDAR might focus on, say, just long-range forward, long-range rear. But the bottom line to adding all of these sensors and especially increasing the resolution of these sensors is the amount of processing power necessary to deal with all that. And that's where the 800 TOPS comes from. And while you have the TOPS leaders in SoCs continuing to be Qualcomm and NVIDIA, and they're leveraging that not only within ADAS, but also to try to expand outside of ADAS and bring infotainment together within kind of a common vehicle architecture. You also see companies like Mobileye and Umbrella that are likewise talking about processing a large number of camera feeds, radar inputs, but strictly retaining that within the ADAS space. So it's interesting that there isn't this common approach that the industry is resolving to of it's got to be one way or not anything else. That we're seeing, I would say it's a maturing of the industry, that it's no longer just about performance, but performance matters for the semiconductors, but it's really the balance between performance, power dissipation, and cost, because all those things play hand in hand together in terms of making a cost-effective solution. And what's cost-effective for one OEM may look different than what's cost-effective for another OEM. So Afila really did a nice job of kind of bringing all that together. We'll see where their takes them, but I thought they were very emblematic of where the industry in general is going.
Go
ahead, Colin.
Just a quick comment too on the cars, just to add the media aspect, that they had a bar in the front of the vehicle that was showing Fortnite. What I like is Sony's a big conglomerate and they're doing a great job of synthesizing everything that they do, right? And so they also emphasize the PlayStation 5 and different apps. They mentioned that there's a partnership with Epic Games that makes Fortnite on the media experience in the vehicle and those different visualizations. And speaking to that Snapdragon partnership, and I'm interested in Phil has to say, we also visited them in the Ride platform. And I felt like I saw a lot of the Ride platform in the Sony vehicle. And what particularly interests me and other people on the team who work on monetization is that Qualcomm showed some referential or benchmark designs on what that could look like, virtual trim, how VPA could interact with that, how biometrics could interact with that for payment systems. But we also showed a lot of good ways on how you would incentivize people to use it with different discounts. So I thought that was really well integrated. And to be honest, looking at the dash between the Ride platform concept and the Sony vehicle and some of the UI UX aspects I saw, I could see that there might be a tighter relationship than we're thinking there.
Yeah, for sure. And Snapdragon was absolutely a part of the announcement, the unveiling of the JPhil brand in the Sony booth there on Wednesday night. So not surprising to see that level of close integration here, especially for a new vehicle. There's a lot that Sony is able to do, but it is still automotive. You need a lot of different supplier partners and a pretty extensive supply chain to be able to actually produce a vehicle. Not at all surprised to see partners playing a big role in this, even for as big as Sony itself is.
Yeah. And one last thing, what's good with a screen, and I know you guys didn't really want me to say this, is they can change their name back to Sony. They got it should be called Sony. I was excited by that. And I'm sure Apple's looking at this closely because it depends. I don't know how much they think of Sony as their competitor, but they're within a consumer electronics sphere and they're making a vehicle that's very stylish, that sort of fits into that future focus aspect and is even in the space gray color that Apple uses. I'm sure they're going to look at what happens here in terms of the success. The one thing I will say too about the car is it's really far away. Saying 2026, that's 3 years away. So it'll just be interesting. Like they're going to constantly have to think about what level of Snapdragon SoC they're on all the way up until the end there. So it'll just be interesting what the final product looks like here. And even the branding, I think everything's still fluid in motion here.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. Unveiling a brand tends to be a pretty big deal, but you're right that a lot of these things are, and they should be malleable, especially when you have a couple of years to go until you get to market. But being flexible around these things is a whole lot easier when you build it into the vehicle from the start. I think the biggest other trend here, especially on, let's say, the automaker side at CES, was this underlying trend of the software defined vehicle. It's a buzzword. It's been around for ages, but it returns very strongly, I think, at CES here this year. Not just from the automaker perspective, where we had Stellantis establishing its own dedicated business unit, Mobile Insights, to capture and eventually monetize the data that they're producing in those vehicles. But also there was a huge proposition here from suppliers to automakers saying, hey, let us help you. Software is complex. We need to be able to marry the hardware together throughout the supply chain. Software is a hugely important part of that. It was still something that we saw on display here at CES. Phil, you had mentioned in our webinar, the Motor Trend Awards, something's very traditionally very hardware and horsepower centric in terms of their recognition, now really shifting to include the software defined vehicle.
Yeah, and to kick off the awards portion of that. So just for everybody's information, Motor Trend hosted Defined Vehicle Innovation Awards 2023 was the inaugural launch of that. There were 15 companies that received recognition or awards in that. That included OEMs, it included non-OEMs. There were it was a recognition, and at the beginning of it, the MC pointed out that Motor Trend traditionally looks at cars through the lens of what's the horsepower, how fast can it accelerate, the kind of things that we've been looking at cars since I was a kid, maybe even before that. And now, so they're acknowledging the importance of software in having these awards, but specifically calling out the importance of software and the software-defined vehicle as a trend that is going to be continuing for the foreseeable future in terms of leveraging what's more and more important to consumers. It's not just about how fast can you get to point A and point B? How are you going to be entertained while you're going there? How much additional time are you going to get back from the car as it's able to do more of the driving tasks for you? Or all in all, whether it is an L1 system or somewhere out in the future, a complete self-driving car, how safe is the drive going to be for the occupants of the car and for those around them? Motor Trend, I think, was emblematic of the shifting importance of automotive and what's important within automotive and how software is carrying a bigger and bigger share of that over time.
Yeah, agreed completely. And I think it's not just the prominence of software and helping to define functionality, it's how that changes over time. And that was a huge part of the proposition statements, right, from suppliers on the show floor and delivering their press conferences beforehand at Mandalay Bay. We have all of these vehicle launches. There were a huge number here this year relative to previous years. but I still think the supply chain has long needed and really appreciates the ability to demonstrate its capabilities here as much towards automakers as it is to the public, because automotive supply chains do tend to be pretty, I don't know, hidden away, right? They tend to be pretty protected. But the suppliers have always been a huge part of the experience at CES. And what we've seen this year in particular is a clear shift from concepts long term, this is what we're capable of doing, towards production ready content and very much this phase of execution on its plans that it has outlined in years past at CES and other events. And that was a big piece of the puzzle here for me with the supply chain on the show floor here in Las Vegas. Do you guys have any highlights here that you want to call out around this execution phase, these production ready focuses from the supply chain? I've got several, but
No, yeah. First off, I agree with you. I think we heard from particular players here and vendors, and I'm going to sum up what they said. Basically, in the past, a lot of these shows, they have people who are contractors from media agencies, and they wear the brand of the vendor, but asking them a detailed question, they're unfortunately are unable to do most of the time. What was mentioned a lot this year is that no actors were there, that these are the actual engineers or the product managers or the SVPs. And this is at the booths, not in the private booths or offsite. And then that these were, like you said, ready to move products. They're in production. Another emphasis was the proper research was on hand to show that money could be saved, that there was a return on investment possible here. So that was important to see. And in general, we've all been going for about a decade or longer. In the past, it was much more conceptual. And I'm sure you're going to speak to it later, but a lot of the L2, L2.5, 3 systems are finally coming to fruition now. So we're seeing a lot of that. One thing I saw from Conti that has recent Continental that recently launched was an ITS system or infrastructure technology here to control vehicles in a parking situation without having L4 park assist technology or 3. And the way it does is so long as you have the proper actuators, you need to have something. It can control where the vehicles go through cellular DV2X. And what it's more meant for is at the factory level. They're moving thousands and thousands of vehicles a day to a big parking lot. There's usually, and then roll in, roll off the ships that bring the vehicles here from other countries. Both those things, they take time, right? They take people you have to hire. And sometimes those are contractors, young people, inexperienced people. And usually they have a 5 to 6% scratch rate. So this is just an example of them showing, hey, you can save money at a certain figure for a certain port that they're working with that I don't want to say the number, but they were saying within 12 to 18 months, when you make that investment, you can make your money back. I haven't really heard people speak that way before at the show, and we heard from other vendors, but that's just one example for me.
yeah, and ITS I think has long been around. There's dedicated events around it, but you're right. The connection here with cellular and the ease to bring that to market and the maturity of the vehicle control systems, actuators, sensors in the vehicle to help support all of that in a very specific use case. That's where we're again getting into this very much not even production ready. Like this stuff is on the road in many cases and already being shipped out to customers. Phil, were you hearing the same things here around execution of previous plans and really moving into this kind of new phase of business?
Yeah, I think that the trend may have started a few years ago, but it's hard to say with the pandemic and everything. With this year, it was, I think, clearly stated repeatedly that this was really about not the vision thing. How do we get to self-driving cars? This was how do we get level 2 plus systems into production? And I think there was much more of an emphasis. Mobileye, for example, with supervision was highlighting that they're going to be rolling that out with Zeekr in 2023. And I think that's becoming more important in the messaging from the suppliers than, hey, how are we going to get to self-driving by 2030, 2035? It was, how am I going to get from making vehicles safer today And then how do I use that to show that I can continue along that trajectory to make cars safer and safer until I get to the limit of a self-driving car. So I think there was much more of an emphasis of here's a sample of a imaging radar. Here's a sample of a domain controller that is in production or will be going into production soon. That was much more a point of focus of emphasis this year than I've ever seen it before, at least on the ADAS and autonomy side of things.
You're absolutely right. I guess I don't want to dismiss the points, right? Suppliers have, first of all, been around for decades at this point. They've been executing this entire time. And to your point, over the last several years, there's been perhaps a little bit less visibility on how some of that messaging may have changed. But in particular, when we talk about automated and autonomous driving, I think that messaging to some extent did shift very clearly because we've had, well, to be honest, the hype around fully autonomous vehicles and autonomous mobility took a major hit in 2022. It's not just Argo being shuttered here from Ford and Volkswagen. Macroeconomic conditions tighten. It's harder to get funding. And all of these propositions around fully autonomous mobility, they're much longer term in terms of return on investment and profitability. Clearly the goal, but that really has impacted the messaging that we saw from a lot of these companies. But those suppliers have also been pushing automated driving level 2 plus level 3 for a number of years. They know that's where their profitability is today. They're making a lot of money on that stuff today. And at the same time, they're able to work towards this eventual future whenever everything aligns, regulations, technology, cost, et cetera, to ultimately bring that to market down the road.
Yeah, and I don't remember who the conversation was with, but I found it interesting to support your point, Jeremy, that one of the suppliers had commented on one of the fears in the industry not many years ago was that the rise of the self-driving car, the robotaxi, was going to cause a reduction in light vehicle production because we were all going to move from a consumer-owned model to a mobility as a service model. And they had said they no longer see that the industry has that fear that one, there's going to be a different market segmentation. Robotaxis are going to do what robotaxis do. Self-driving cars and down within consumers are going to do what they do, but they're no longer really in competition with each other. And I thought that was interesting in that it showed again the maturity of the industry, and it gave I think the OEMs some confidence that the investment that they're making in adding these types of technology capabilities to their cars does have the potential for not taking their business down, that in fact they'll continue to sell cars and the content per car is going to go up. So for those of us in the semiconductor world, it's the best of both worlds. People are still going to be buying cars like they always have, and they're going to be buying them with more content instead of trying to wrestle with when's the light vehicle production curve going to break, and suddenly all of a sudden we're going to be making fewer and fewer cars on an annual basis. That's either pushed out so far out in the future nobody's talking about it, or they've decided that model is no longer applicable to the reality of things, and self-driving is not going to be reducing the number of cars that people buy.
Agreed completely. I do think it is more of a longer term proposition. And to some extent, I think it's already been factored into the decade of the 2030s, where that total vehicle volume is going to be. I think we still have it. There's an expectation there that in particular, shared mobility services will have perhaps more on the second car in a household rather than
Sure.
the first.
Yeah.
But I think that's a part of that kind of the automotive can't grow infinitely. We've had a relatively flat curve, let's say, in total vehicle outlook over the next 10, 12 years for long as I can remember. But you're right that content per vehicle, where vehicle volume might be growing by a couple of % every year, content per vehicle here, in terms of autonomous and semiconductor, is up by a factor of 3 here over several years. There's quite a bit of growth that occurs, and that in particular fuels that profitability for suppliers here over the near term. And I think that messaging just was a little bit more refined at CES this year, but we still saw autonomous, and specifically level 4 fully autonomous, a pretty prominent part of a number of press conferences and product demonstrations from a number of these companies. I'm thinking of ZF unveiling their next generation shuttle with a new sensor suite that allows them to drive in mixed traffic instead of just these fixed routes or dedicated lanes. Holon separated out from Benteler last year and is planning on launching one of these shuttles in 2025. It's this concept of very kind of targeted deployments has become a little bit more clear in that messaging. And it's not
Hmm.
just everything's going to be autonomous. We're going to drive everywhere next year. That was still very much a part of the messaging at the same time as they're emphasizing what we can do today and how we're bringing our manufacturing scale to customers already. I can think of Conti, Vallejo, Bosch, Forvia. So many of these major tier one suppliers were um, showcasing the scale, the number of sensors that they've produced over the last 20 years, a very significant number of those being produced in the last 1 to 2 years, demonstrating that scaling up of their manufacturing capability. Not just to say, hey, we've been here for a long time and we're still doing this and we're doing it well, but to show that the growth in the industry is there and the prospects for their near term are very strong. I suspect
So
we
in
heard
terms of
much.
that, I did see some things related to what you guys are talking about, right? That Mercedes launched their automatic lane change. They mentioned that,
Yeah,
and that
in the
they,
North American market.
yeah, and the compliance right now that they can launch in Nevada and California, right, with JPhil.
Yep, they got their first level 3 approval here in the United States and the state of Nevada. Actually, I think the first day of the show, I was walking by the booth when they announced that. They weren't sure if they were going to be able to publicize it.
Yeah, it was well timed. And I think you went to Luminar and they showed their roof LiDAR system, I think Iris, and that launch too, or is about to launch on the SAC, AIC, R7, and the Volvo XC90, which was another vehicle prominently showed here.
Yep, but both of them, the X90 and this sensor already being standard in all of the EV platforms from Volvo, very much a clear part of their strategy and in place, in progress already in Europe. Same with that R7. It's available over in China right now. What they showed here was that North American variant, again, with this Luminar LiDAR sensor integrated into the vehicle, into that kind of roof module between the windshields. That shows not just what Luminar is going to be able to do here in the near term in terms of starting to produce sensors in production vehicles, but that maturity of integration also into production vehicles has been a pretty common theme throughout the supply chain over the last several years as LiDAR has moved from concept and kind of laboratory instrument and development platform into something that's a part of production vehicles here already today, much less coming in the future.
Absolutely. And I know we're probably getting close to the end. I just wanted to mention two things about electrification. One is that Mercedes also announced that they're making their own EV charging network, and it should start to launch in 2027 in North America and then follow the rest of the world. They're going to put it in Europe and China as well. So they're looking about 400 locations here, dealing more with the high side. So probably 350 kilowatt. And they're talking about 2,500 cabinets or connectors, as we call them here, stations, excuse me. And we just recently, S&P published, you'll be able to search it on Google, article about a study we've done on how many chargers we need in this country. So this, of course, is very beneficial to that. Visteon also showed, they make the Ultium platform. So this is one of the, they guys in the show, that's one of the big kahunas, right, in infotainment and display, and they remain that. And they still showed plenty of that at their private booth. But there was a big emphasis on their wireless gateway that they incorporate in the Ultium platform, that the batteries themselves, no human is involved in the manufacturing process, which is helping with the reliability aspect here. Having a wireless system, reducing that wiring in the vehicle not only helps with lightweighting, but it can also help with certain integrity issues with CAN. They're using their own proprietary system that's based off the Bluetooth protocols, and they explained to me what they're doing to make sure that it is always a solid connection and latency issues. So I thought I learned a lot there. They were also showing lightweighting around different aspects, and particularly miniaturization. One thing that's can be an issue as you're miniaturizing, they were showing also their bidirectional DC to DC charger is galvanic isolation. So as you bring these pieces closer and closer together, and an electrical vehicle or in computers as well, it's harder to manage the voltage between the different systems. So that's also really important if you want to be in that battery management game to show something like that. And they had a great product.
Yeah, agreed. It's challenging at a show like this to cover everything. You're right. We're getting close to our time here, so we'll wrap up. But it is just impossible to highlight the breadth of topics, much less the number of companies that are showing some really interesting things on the show floor. We've touched on a number of them today, but from Harman with a lot of its more production ready focus and on its booth around driver monitoring, occupant monitoring, biometrics, the ready on demand software platform to deliver this monetization to automakers, everyone from Morelli, Panasonic, ZF, Visteon, you mentioned here and Tom, both doing really interesting things with maps and their mapping platforms. It's just impossible to really close out and cover everything that we saw at the show. And I think that's a testament to how strongly the industry has come back from a couple of years of disruption here at a really important industry event with some really interesting exhibitions and new products here being launched. I want to say thank you. We're pretty much out of time here. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. It was great to see you also in Las Vegas, and looking forward to another big event here next year. But
Thanks for
the
including
input.
us.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to all of our listeners here for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your feedback, and new ideas on today's episode or any other topic at our autology@spglobal.com email. And of course, you can find more online at Auto Tech Insights. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Goodbye for now.